Hello, I am Mr. Buffer. In this series, I will share creepy stories with you. If you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Enjoy. I awoke to the sun shining through the slit in the curtains, and an odd feeling. When I sat up, I was struck with confusion when I saw my surroundings. This wasn't my house. How did I end up passed out on the floor in someone else's home? Pre-K, think. What happened last night? I said, rubbing my head in what seemed like a futile effort to make the memory return. Just then, something clicked. The party. My friends and colleagues held a party in celebration of another successful book completed. Did I really drink that much? No, it wasn't that. I knew what a hangover felt like, and this feeling I had wasn't that. Something didn't feel right. I didn't feel right. It was as if something was missing, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. I went to stand up, but froze at what I saw next. I saw blood that smeared and stained the hardwood floor. I jolted to my feet and searched my body for any cuts or scars. I found nothing. If I wasn't the one who had been hurt, then that meant that someone else was here with me, possibly bleeding to death. I shoved my hands in my pockets, rummaging around for my phone, so that I could call for help. Searching my pockets for the phone lead to no avail. I looked around the room once more to see if there was a phone that I could use. I saw nothing. I explored my unfamiliar environment only to find that there were no phones whatsoever in this house. Maybe if I went outside and found the neighbor, they could help. I looked outside and saw that I was in the middle of nowhere. I had no neighbors to call upon. This was bad. I had to find the other person and get out of there fast. I looked everywhere, opening door after door. I looked in bedrooms, bathrooms, upstairs. I called out to the person, hoping that they would yell back and I could pinpoint their location. I heard nothing. Suddenly, out of the nothing, I heard a truck pull up outside. I ran down the hall in a panic. I came face to face with yet another door. It was open, though, and I could only assume that, at the time, it led to the basement. I heard footsteps making their way to the front door. I entered and quickly made my way into the darkness. I tried to be as careful as I possibly could while descending the steps into the pitch-black basement. As soon as my foot touched the floor, I heard the door upstairs open, then slam shut. "Honey, I'm home, and I've got a surprise for you," he shouted as I heard footsteps making their way to the basement. I stumbled around, trying to find a place to hide or something to hit him over the head with. Just then, I tripped over something. I hit the ground, then started feeling around to see if I could figure out what it was. I grabbed a hold of something, someone's foot. For a split second, I was relieved to have found the other person. It was still kind of dark, so I couldn't really see much, but I was able to make out the shape of a girl sitting in a chair. "Don't worry," I whispered. "We'll get out of here soon." Our captor was at the threshold of the basement. I turned around, looking for a place to hide. Something caught my eye. I saw the tools that were sprawled out on top of a table, glistening in what little light had filled the room. I scurried under the table and pressed myself tightly up against the wall. I saw a bat leaning against the side of the table. When he wasn't paying attention, That's when I'd make my move and get both of us out of here. He turned on the light when he hit the bottom step. The captor came into view. Well, the bottom half of him, anyway. He was wearing dress shoes and a tux. I saw the girl a little more clearly now. She was covered with scars. Her skin was a sickening tint of white from the amount of blood that she lost. Isn't it beautiful? Well, it's not nearly as beautiful as you are, though. The unknown man draped a silky white dress over the girl and got down on one knee. The edge of the table was just barely covering his face. He took her hand and slid a ring on her finger. The way her arm dropped to her side reminded me of a rag doll. I wondered how she could be so calm and so still in this situation. That's when I realized the grim fact that she was dead. I let out a gasp, then quickly covered my mouth in an effort to stop the noise. The man didn't seem notice. You've made me a very happy man. You know that. I mean, we've had our moments, but I never stopped believing that we would be together someday. I listened closely to him. He sounded very familiar. Did I actually know this psycho from somewhere? He stood up and made his way toward the table. I slowly extended my hand towards the bat. He shuffled through his tools for a second and finally found what he was looking for. A book dropped to his side. My book. He turned around, gave the corpse a kiss on the cheek, and made his way toward the stairs. Now was my chance. I gripped the bat and shot out from under the table. When I was right behind him, I closed my eyes and swung as hard as I could. After a moment, I opened my eyes and saw him standing not 3 inches from my face. I jolted back and fell. I closed my eyes again and started frantically swinging. Get the hell away from me. I kept waving the bat around, hoping that when I opened my eyes again, he would be laying face down. I stopped for a second and hesitantly opened my eyes. He was still standing, looking straight ahead at the body in the chair. How was he still standing? How could he not have noticed me screaming and hitting him with a bat? I'll let you get ready, he said, before turning round and making his way up the stairs. After seeing his face, it hit me. He was at the party. I could have sworn that I saw him at the party. He was one of the waiters. He brought me my drink. Then, the rest is kind of fuzzy, but I vaguely recall him carrying me out to the truck. Then I was here, and he took the bat and weighted the bat. I got ready to swing again, only to find that I wasn't holding it. I looked back at the table, and there it was, propped up against the side. But I could have sworn that I had grabbed it. What the hell was going on? Then I saw something that explained why I couldn't grab the bat and the feeling that I had earlier. That feeling that something was missing. I soon realized that what was missing was a heartbeat when I saw my body sitting in the chair with the forehead bashed in. I usually like to watch TV with my little sister, Kimberly. She was only 5, so of course, she watched all the cutesy kids shows. I didn't really mind, though they made her happy, and I liked spending time with her. She watched shows like Dora, Blue's Clues, and Arthur. We often had a lot of DVDs of old kids' shows around the house that we would watch. There was a large box of old movies and TV shows in the attic. I took a brief look at it once, but none of them looked like they would appeal to her. One day, Kimberly was at a doctor's appointment, and I thought I'd have time to watch a movie aimed more towards my age range. So I thought this would be a good time to look through the box of old movies in the attic. While I looked through the box, I noticed that these movies didn't really interest me. But I kept looking in hopes to find something. Then I saw, at the bottom of the box, a DVD labeled Colwyn's Corner. Many memories started to come back to me. I used to watch this show as a kid. It was about an orange puppet named Colwyn, who lived in a house on the corner of a street. He would often have his other puppet friends come over to play games and sing songs. It was cute and innocent, and I remember really liking it as a kid. I thought this would be a good show for my sister and I to watch. When Kimberly got home, I told her I got a new show for us to watch. She got excited and sat down on the couch while I put the disc in. I sat down next to her as the selection screen popped up. The screen looked just as I remembered it. It showed Colwyn and his friends in front of the house. I chose the first episode and the theme song began. I was a little confused. The colors were a lot darker than I remember, and the song was sung a lot slower and in a deeper voice. I didn't think much of it, as I hadn't seen the show in a long time, and I probably forgot some elements of it. The show began pretty normally. Colwyn was in his house and said hello to the viewers. There was a knock on his door, and he said, "I think my friends are here." When he opened the door, I felt my heart to my throat. Standing at the door were two tall white puppets with no nose or mouth, only pitch black eyes. I was shocked because I don't even remember these characters on the show. Even the cover of the DVD showed two colorful, friendly puppets. I looked over at Kimberly, and she had this big smile on her face. I was confused, since an image like that would terrify a child. "I'm not sure if we should watch this anymore," I told her. "No, please, keep it on," she exclaimed. I continued watching as the giant puppets didn't seem to faze her. The two large puppets came into the house. Colwyn asked, "What do you guys want to do today?" The one puppet replied with the most horrific sound I ever heard. It sounded like a man was shouting, almost screaming in a strange language. The audio was very distorted. At this point, I got up and ejected the disc from the VCR, much to Kimberly's disappointment. "Why did you stop it?" "Put it back on," she said. I didn't listen and put the DVD in a drawer. Even though Kimberly wasn't bothered by the show, I still thought it was too disturbing for a 5-year-old. I had trouble sleeping that night. I kept thinking about the video. I watched that show all the time when I was younger. I definitely have seen every episode. I didn't understand why I didn't remember an episode like this. I was still curious about the rest of the episode. I decided to go downstairs to finish it. I took the DVD out of the drawer and put it in the VCR. I put on headphones so the noise wouldn't disturb my family. The episode began the same, with the strange intro and the large puppets. After the one puppet made the terrifying sound, Colwyn replied, "You're right, we should play a game." He then grabbed a knife off the counter. It cut to a live-action arm painted orange to represent Colwyn's. The knife went up to the arm and started to cut slits, each one deeper than the last. Colwyn started to scream, a blood-curdling scream. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt sick to my stomach. Blood gushed out of the wounds as the screams got louder and louder. It then cut to a live-action neck painted orange. The knife went up to the throat and cut a deep slit in it, and blood began gushing out. It showed Colwyn gasping heavily for air before his eyes turned completely white. The episode ended with him falling to the ground as the two tall white puppets looked directly into the camera with pitch black eyes. I was utterly terrified at this point. I immediately ejected the DVD and threw it in the trash. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about the episode. I got up the next morning and went downstairs to get some breakfast. I walked past Kimberly's room and saw that she wasn't in there. When I got downstairs, I saw her on the couch, finishing up the horrific episode I watched last night. I immediately grabbed the remote and turned the TV off. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Where did you get the DVD?" "It was in the garbage," she replied. "I took it out because I wanted to finish the episode." "This show is very bad," I shouted. "No, it's not," she said. "They were just baking a cake." "What?" I said. "The episode was about Colwyn and his friends baking a cake," she replied. I was shocked. "What did his friends look like?" "One was blue and one was red," she replied. "I really liked it. Can I watch it again?" It was cold, cold and dark. That's all I could feel when I stared into the black abyss that made up its eyes. There was a tingling sensation in my feet that slowly rose up in my body like panic trapped inside of me. I felt changed. I don't know what he was doing to me, but it freaked me out. My heart started pounding. But that was the only part of my body that moved. I couldn't blink. I couldn't even breathe. All I could do was stare into those big black eyes. Those big, beautiful eyes. Like a night sky full of breathtaking stars. But these stars were moving. Slowly but surely. Not just moving. Spinning. It was mesmerizing. It was hypnotizing. It was beautiful. He was beautiful. I wanted to thank him for this. These stars. They were the most beautiful things I had ever laid my eyes upon. I wanted to praise him. I wanted to worship him. And then, like a warm embrace, my body was relieved of the coldness. And I gained the ability to move again. He'd released me and disappeared, but I knew what to do. I must worship him. I must be like him. With the Starry Night image still in mind, I slowly reached for my pocket knife. I went for my eyes first. They'd already seen the best thing they'd ever see, so why bother with all these inferior sights? I didn't need them anymore. The beautiful vision would forever be in my memories anyway. With the stars still in mind, I brought my knife to my eyes. First the left, then the right, forever blinding myself from my unworthy surroundings. There, I could finally see my stars. Nothing but the stars. With a pleased smile, I sat down and brought the knife to my legs, slowly peeling both the skin and the flesh away, leaving nothing but the bone. It took ages, but I knew it would be worth it. I would be beautiful. Beautiful like him. Beautiful like Bigface. Chicken, Don taunted. It's just a forest. A forest where people go missing. Brick grunted in return. Normally he'd be up for a camping trip, but recently the walls in the city had been decorated with pictures of people who'd gone missing. You don't know if the forest is where people go missing, Dan added. No one knows what's happened. That is, unless you're scared of Bigface. Brick shoved Dan hard. You know I'm not superstitious, he yelled at him, but Dan only laughed. Oh, he's real, he taunted. I've seen him myself. Brick glared at him. You're lying. You wouldn't be alive if you'd seen him, he shouted. You sure know a lot about someone you claim doesn't exist, Dan continued. You sure it's not because you're a chicken? I'm not a chicken, Brick yelled again. Dan smirked. Then prove it. Fine. We'll go on your stupid camping trip, Brick answered, trying his hardest not to stutter. Deal. I'll see you on Saturday, 3 p.m., in front of the forest, Dan instructed. Deal. I'll see you. Brick agreed, and the two boys parted ways. Walking home, Brick felt terrified already, but he didn't want to be a chicken. It was just stupid superstition. After all, most towns had their own tales, right? Brick laughed to himself, feeling a tad bit braver. Surely none of them sounded as silly as Bigface. For a while, Brick started to wonder why he'd even be scared in the first place. He snorted. A massive floating head. Surely whoever came up with the tale must have been drunk. What would a floating head even do? Headbutt you to death. Brick laughed. No, Bigface was definitely just a myth. A silly myth indeed. When Brick came home, he threw himself on the sofa and turned on his PlayStation. He knew his mother would be against it, but what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. He played for what seemed like hours, until he suddenly heard a car pull up. Shit, he thought to himself, and quickly turned everything off, running upstairs, and only just made it before he heard the front door unlock. He pulled the first book he could reach out of his bag and turned to a random page, pretending to be deep into homework. After a few minutes, he heard a knock on his door and looked up to see his mother peeking into his room. They started some small talk about Brick's day at school, and eventually Brick asked his mum if he could spend the night at Dan's place on Saturday. His mother smiled at him, pleased he was finally getting along with someone. Sure, honey, she replied. Do you want a ride there? Brick rejected her offer, knowing he couldn't tell her where he was really going. He deemed it better to go by bike. He knew Dan would bring a tent. Dan's parents were never home to notice what Dan was doing anyway. Brick sighed, wishing he was as lucky as Dan. Brick would be 12 in a few months. But his mother insisted on treating him as if he was 7, and surely she'd never let him stay the night in the forest. But she didn't need to know that's where he was going. Thanks for letting me go, Mum, Brick murmured, returning to his pretend homework. His mother smiled in return before heading downstairs to cook dinner. Brick sighed with relief. though a part of him wished she wouldn't have agreed to the sleepover. The confidence from earlier was gone, and he was definitely terrified again. That night, Brick barely slept. Whenever he closed his eyes, he'd see floating faces grinning at him. One of the nightmares was him rushing through the forest, with a massive face chasing him, and its horrifying laughter echoing in the woods. Brick's eyes flew open, and he breathed heavily for a while. Eventually, he rolled onto his side, attempting to fall asleep again. And there, on his extra pillow, laid a big mask, grinning at him. Brick was up in an instant, drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. He looked around frantically to ensure he was awake for real this time. After rubbing his eyes for what seemed like minutes, he finally checked his alarm. Still 3 hours of sleep left. Brick sighed, wishing this terrible night would just end. The nightmares continued playing out for the rest of the night, and Brick was still tired when his alarm rang. However, he didn't want to go back to sleep, though he definitely wanted to stay at home. He couldn't have Dan calling him a chicken in front of everyone at school. So he got out of bed and started getting ready. Brick barely had any breakfast, and made sure to hide the food he threw out well in the garbage so his mum wouldn't notice. He spent the rest of his time packing his backpack before he yelled goodbye to his mother and ventured out on his bike. Brick's heart was pounding as he cycled, and he knew it wasn't from exhaustion, judging by the slow tempo he kept. All the way there, Brick kept telling himself to relax and calm down. Bigface wasn't real. He and Dan would be just fine. They'd have fun camping in the woods. The only thing they'd find in there would be the trees and animals, Brick thought. The normal animals. Big floating heads weren't real, and Brick and Dan would prove that. Brick would never let Dan know he was scared. Puffing out his chest a bit, he finally pulled up to the forest where Dan was waiting for him. The boys spent most of their time setting up their tent and collecting wood for a fire. When everything was finally ready, the sun had set. The boys sat around the fire, keeping warm. Brick was happy they'd lit the fire before it had gone dark. The fire provided enough light and warmth for the boys to stay up for a bit, though fear was starting to sneak up on Brick. The noises in the forest started to get on Brick's nerves, and even the slightest sound made him twitch a little. Brick moved closer to the fire to pretend his slight shivering was from being cold. Suddenly, Brick heard a loud snap that made him jump. Out of fear, he turned round to see where the noise came from, and he found Dan laughing out loud while holding both ends of the stick he broke. "Dude, you should have seen your face," Dan laughed. "Your reaction was priceless." "That's not funny," Brick shouted, standing up to confront him. Dan stopped laughing. Good, Brick thought. It seemed he had some effect on Dan after all. He'd show him not to mess with him like that. He'd show him he wasn't a chicken. Don't you have anything better to do than joke around all day? When will you actually start taking things seriously? Brick growled angrily, looking down at Dan. But Dan wasn't looking at Brick. Dan was looking at something behind Brick. "What? Cat's got your tongue?" Brick continued angrily, but Dan only pointed at something behind Brick. "Yeah, I'm not falling for your tricks," Brick snorted. It wasn't until Dan's eyes got wide with fear and his pointing more desperate that Brick finally turned around. And there, a few yards away, Brick saw something move. It had a human-like silhouette, but there was something off about the way it moved. As it got closer, Brick noticed how thin the person was. They must have been lost and not eaten for days, Brick thought to himself. The boys just kept staring at it, and eventually Brick realized the reason behind the thin appearance. Surely, the creature was human, or at least it used to be. The person's body was literally just bones. But what really scared the boys was the face. The entire body was missing its skin and flesh, but the face was intact. However, the area around the eyes was covered with dried blood, and the eyes appeared to have been slashed. Brick stared long enough at the morbid face to realize this person was one of the missing people from the posters he'd seen. Feeling sick and terrified, he turned to Dan so they could run. But Dan was being held by another walking skeleton, its face just as terrifying as the first one. Another missing person, Brick assumed. He took a step back in fear and started to look around for a means of escape. But wherever he looked, he only saw more and more skeletons appearing. Brick didn't know what to do. He couldn't leave Dan, and he couldn't spot any way out. Eventually, he saw something else coming out from between the trees. Something bigger. Brick froze in place, completely unable to move. Now both he and Dunn were forced to look at the creature emerging from the forest. Brick started to feel a tingling sensation rising up from his feet, and he soon realized the creature was little more than a face. Bigface, he thought to himself. And despite their rising panic, Brick and Dunn remained rooted in place as Bigface floated closer. At the same time, the walking skeletons began gathering behind the boys, also staring at Bigface. It wasn't until the enormous bulbous head of the creature was before the boys that Brick noticed its eyes. Its big black eyes. Its big, beautiful black eyes, full of stars. Both Brick and Dan continued, staring into the eyes until Bigface eventually disappeared. The skeletons let go of Dan and started to leave as well. Both Brick and Dan dropped to their knees, searching for rocks. But not just any rocks. They needed sharp rocks. Rocks that were sharp enough to cut. Bigface had shown them the stars, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to see them again. They needed to worship him, to be like him. They needed to be beautiful,